and thank you very much for organising this series of talks. And thank you to everyone who has come today. It's lovely to see you all here. So today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to, first of all, start off with looking at what is a metaphor. And why should researchers exploring people's beliefs and ideas be interested in it? Then we're going to look at metaphor analysis and what this has been used to explore in education. We're going to think about how to write a good research question for metaphor research, and also look at metaphor elicitation as an innovative research method. And then finally, I'll give you a step-by-step introduction to analysing and interpreting metaphor in your spoken and written data. And I'll be drawing on some of my own research data for that. Okay. So let's start off by looking at a short excerpt from a research interview that aimed to elicit a language learner's views on cultures of learning. And the interviewee was asked to complete the following. So a language teacher is. And my question to you, and you can think about it and maybe put your ideas in the chat, is how is the teacher being described here? Okay, and what is the teacher being compared to? All right, and another question is, how is learning being conceptualized here? How is learning being described, and what is it being compared to? Okay, so you can maybe think about that, put ideas in your chat, and you probably saw and guessed that, or can see that the language teacher is being compared to a guide, all right? And learning is being compared here, being described as being like a journey, okay? So the role of a teacher and learning, they're quite abstract concepts, quite slippery concepts. And we can see here that the interviewee conceptualizes learning in a certain way and to use metaphors to offer us some insights and some information about their own ideas and experiences for what learning means for them. Okay. And a metaphor, here's a nice definition, one that I really like. A metaphor is a device, so it could be written language, it could be spoken language, verbal language, or a picture. So it's a device through which we perceive or experience one entity in terms of another. Okay. So a bit more about what a metaphor is. A metaphor, the word metaphor derives from the ancient Greek, metaphorein, which means carry across. And from the example in the previous slide, we can see that meaning is being carried across from one experience domain, so journey, to another, learning. Okay. Which can be represented like this. So aspects of the more concrete experience domain are mapped onto the more abstract experience domain of learning. And in the literature, we refer to this often the more concrete experience as the source domain, and the abstract, the more abstract experience domain as the target domain. Okay. And as Collar points out, the word metaphor is actually itself a metaphoric expression, and it can be traced back to the conceptual metaphor meaning is an object. And she goes on to point out that we in the West, we tend to conceptualize meaning as an object that can be moved from one place to another. Okay. So what about metaphor then in discourse, metaphor in written and spoken language? Because that's what we as researchers are interested in if we're looking at metaphor in our written and spoken texts. Well, from the previous example, we can see that we can understand metaphor from a cognitive perspective. We can see it as a cognitive process, an intrinsic part of our conceptual apparatus. And this is something that Lakoff and Johnson, in their seminal work, Metaphors We Live By, highlighted and pointed out. And since then, the fields of cognitive and linguistics and cognitive semantics have explored this aspect of metaphor. However, it's also a performative act. So our thoughts and beliefs are not only represented by language, but they're also constructed in and through discourse. So social constructionists are interested in this dimension of metaphor as well. So it's helpful, I think, to see these ways that we can understand metaphor as sitting on a cline. So some researchers are more interested in the cognitive dimension, and others are maybe more interested in the discursive dimension of metaphor. And there are, of course, then researchers like myself who sit really in the middle, okay? So who acknowledge both the cognitive and the discursive dimensions. And they tend to see metaphor use and as a dynamic, a sort of interaction between cognition and discourse. Okay, so let's apply this theory then to an example. So I've taken this from an interview carried out by Claire Cramch in her research. And we have here a speaker who chooses to describe language learning as traveling to new places, okay? So we could say the speaker here has mapped the source domain travel onto the target domain language learning to show us how she conceptualizes her experiences. Okay. It's also a linguistic phenomenon. So we could say that the speaker has used the linguistic resources available to her in that moment to realize her conceptualization of language learning. And I think this is particularly important when we've got working in a multilingual context, because speakers may then choose to draw on not only English, but maybe even their own mother tongue if they feel it's appropriate as well. Then we need to acknowledge as well the discourse aspect of it. So the situation and the context that this utterance is made. So we need to consider the topic that is being talked about, the mode, whether it's spoken, whether it's written, whether it's a hybrid text, and also then the interpersonal dimension as well. So who is speaking to who? And interestingly, and it's important at this point to think about the power relationship between the interviewer here and the interviewee. So all these factors come into play, okay? So it's not only a cognitive feature, we need to consider the linguistic and also the whole discourse situation as well. And these factors, they interact with each other in what many researchers believe is to be a very dynamic system. Okay, but why metaphor in education then? So metaphors matter in education because they frame and they guide our thinking. They can help us understand and communicate difficult abstract concepts. So here, for example, we talk about learning from in terms of being a construction. So we're building something, and we use terms like scaffolding to talk about how a more knowledgeable peer is then supporting the learning of another. Okay, so this conceptualization of learning is very different to the sort of transmission and delivery conceptualization, where we think of the teacher just transmitting knowledge from themselves to the learner like that. Then we often use the word tool. Okay, so we sometimes conceptualize learning and teaching to be a job, and we need instruments and tools to help us with that. In language learning, there's at the moment quite a debate about whether we should talk about grammar as a set of rules, or is grammar a resource that learners bring to a situation as well? And these concepts, the way we kind of construe the situation, I think can have a real impact in how we teach and how we learn in the classroom. So they help us understand and communicate difficult concepts, but also they frame a situation from a viewpoint. And I think, the example of whether we talk about learners as learners or whether we use the word client in sort of more neoliberal context is a good example of that. Okay, so as we have seen, metaphors highlight then and make coherent certain aspects of our experience. Metaphors may create realities for us, especially in social realities. And one way of seeing understanding metaphors this way is that you could see them as being a set of lenses, and we see the world differently if we put on, let's say, our sunglasses or our lenses that have a kind of blue tint to them. So they make us see things in different ways. And here are two examples here that I drew out from the literature. Here we can see that, the student is being, and learning is being conceptualized here as a sort of an investment, that learning is a form of spending money or investing money into something here. So this really comes from the fact that metaphors, one of the features of metaphors is that there is selective mapping. So certain aspects of the source domain and the more concrete experience domain are foregrounded, whilst others are then placed in the background. Okay, and these selective mappings can serve an ideological agenda of the text producer, so the person who is writing or speaking the text. And they enable us to represent experience from a particular viewpoint, And this is really particularly important if there is this power imbalance, and if those in power are kind of imposing their metaphors on us. And researchers who are interested in this, would call themselves maybe critical metaphor analysts. Okay. All right, so let's go on to think about what makes a good research question. And I have one here. So what conceptual metaphors for learning a language are suggested by the language use of a group of pre-sessional language learners? So this might be something that you are interested in. And I've highlighted what I think, and I'm drawing from Veronica Kohler's work here as well. So the words in red here, what conceptual metaphors, I think it's important, to acknowledge that metaphors do have this cognitive aspect as well as the linguistic aspect. So, highlight that with the word conceptual, and at the same time, acknowledge as well that they're a linguistic phenomenon. Okay, so remember to use, the language used by, that you're going to be looking at the actual language use. Also, which I think is really important, is Kohler reminds us to use the word suggested rather than shown and demonstrated. And this really is an important point, because we can't get into someone's head. Okay, we don't know exactly what they are thinking. We are only using the language that is produced as a form of evidence. So it can only suggest things, all right? And I see that rather like footprints in the sand. Okay, we only have what's left after the person has walked across the beach. Okay. All right, so what has metaphor analysis been used to explore in education then? So I'll go through some examples now. It's been used to explore teachers' beliefs and conceptions about teaching and professional identity, and there are some examples. It's been used, as we've just seen, to explore learners' conceptualizations of learning. It's been used also in language learning education, so learners' conceptualization during language learning. There's been quite a lot of research in that area. And then also when it comes to the specific subject areas that, for example, in science, Alice Stagnan and colleagues, they explored students, learners' understandings of the term greenhouse effect and how it differed from how scientists use the term and how it's used in textbooks in schools as well. So that was a really fascinating area of research. It's also been used to look at textbooks, so how metaphors are used in textbooks. And some research that I've done is looking at how multilinguals use metaphors in home contexts. And here, what I found that they can often be children can be often very creative with their use, especially in trying to sort of achieve their social agenda in a home situation. Okay. All right. So let's move on then and have a look at quite an innovative research method. So metaphor elicitation. And so what is this? This is when the interviewer really asks the interviewee to compare something with something else. So like in the example we had right in the beginning on the first slide, a teacher is and then they have to think of something that is similar to a teacher. Also, another example, language is, okay, and this is, I'm going to talk about it in a minute. This is an area of research that myself and Lavinia Hershu, who also works here in the School of Education, carried out as part of a project, and we'll look at some of the data in a minute. But you know, why use this research method? Well, what I found from using it, and also this is you know, others have said this as well, it stimulates engagement. So I found that the participants were really engaged. They found it fun. They enjoyed it. It evokes creative thinking, imagination, empathy as well. So it was great in sort of starting a discussion going. And especially if you're working in a multilingual environment, there is really scope then for sort of comparing metaphors and conceptualizations like that. Also, it can be used on its own independently, but it could also be part of your interview that you have. You could have other questions as well. So, you know, there are various ways that you can use it. Okay, so metaphor elicitation. One of the maybe things you need to be careful of is that people can be incredibly creative and imaginative in this situation. And one of the things you do need to check is whether the metaphor is just a one-off. Okay, so maybe in that situation, they come up with a really creative metaphor and you're thinking, okay, this is interesting, but you know, how representative is this metaphor? So some of the things you can do is to ask the interviewee to draw and talk about the metaphor. So say why, you know, that is a good metaphor for them. You can look beyond the interview and look at educational material and identify similar metaphors that have been used. So this then gives you the sense of, okay, it's not only this one person speaking, but others belonging to the same discourse community also tend to, you know, talk about this phenomenon in that way. You can also look at classroom observations and enacted metaphors in activities that the interviewee does. So do some kind of triangulation work there. And then also, again, have a look at, you know, other texts that have been produced by the same, you know, people in that discourse community as well. So that gives you a kind of sense that it's just not a one-off, but it's something that is characteristic of that discourse community. Okay. Other things to consider, the age, okay. Children do, unlike what much research has said, recent research has done, you know, a lot of work with children using metaphor. It's just that maybe certain